St. Petersburg. This city has become sacred to every Russian citizen. Some of the most glorious pages of Russian history and culture are closely associated with St. Petersburg. The whole city is itself a wonderful monument, a museum. It is music fixed in stone. This northern city on the Neva River is a city of magic beauty, sung by poets and painted by artists. A city of marvelous white nights, a city of broad straight avenues, green parks, and countless bridges and canals. I love you, citadel of Peters. I love your elegant austerity of line, your broad Neva, whose gracious waters mid granite-clad embankments shine. I love your traceried iron of gate and railing, the moonless brilliance of the light that sheds a beauty never paling upon your meditative night. When neither lamp nor candle needing, I sit composing verse or reading, and slumbering mansions towering high stand clear against the lucid sky. An extract from The Bronze Horseman by Alexander Pushkin. The greatest architects of the 18th and 19th centuries created magnificent ensembles in our city. It was founded by Tsar Peter the Great, and for 200 years remained the capital of the vast Russian Empire. We will never forget the heroic deeds of the citizens of Leningrad, who, during the war, were under siege and yet withstood. St. Petersburg is often frequented by tourists from abroad. St. Petersburgers themselves are very hospitable and generous, and our city has friendly associations and business ties with many cities in the world. Today, St. Petersburg is the twin city of many foreign towns, for example, Manchester, Dresden, Le Havre, Gdansk, and Turku. People of the twin cities organize a lot of festivals, exhibitions, and sport competitions, and such meetings help world peace. Everybody should know the history of St. Petersburg. Its history and culture is inseparably connected with the history and culture of all of our country, as St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia for more than 2 centuries, from 1712 through to 1918. St. Petersburg has its own spirit, and this is the reason we decided to call our film The Spirit of St. Petersburg. We dedicate our film to the 300th anniversary of the city's foundation. The Neva lands were joined to the ancient Russian state, and in the 12th century they were in the possession of the rich Novgorod feudal republic. Through the Neva and the Volkhov, Novgorod had vast trade connections with Denmark, Sweden, the Livonian Order, and other European states. The lands attracted not only merchants, and from the 13th century a long-lasting fight of Russia against the conquerors for Neva lands began. In 1240, on July the 15th, the Swedish Crusaders were defeated on the Neva banks by Prince Alexander Nevsky. In 1323, Novgorodians, trying to protect their lands and trade waterways, constructed the fortress Orishek Nut in the Neva source, but soon it was captured by the Swedes. In 1611, having captured the Neva banks, the Swedish general built the fortress Nynchans on the Okhtinsky Cape near Nevskoye Ustya, and in 1617 the Izhora lands were torn away from Russia. The Neva lands were named by the Swedes as Ingermanland. the way to the Western Europe for Russian merchants was now closed. In 1700, Peter I resumed the struggle with Sweden for Russian exit to the Baltic Sea. It was known as the Northern War from 1700 to 1721. The beginning of the war was not successful. The Swedish king, Karl XII, had defeated the Russian troops besieging Narva. In 1702, on October the 11th, the fortress Noteberg, former Odeshirk, was captured by the Russian army. In 1703, the Russian army went to the Neva mouth, and on the 25th of April, the fortress Ninshats was besieged. On the 2nd of May, the Russian army celebrated its victory. On the 9th of May, Peter I summoned a military council. It was decided to build a new fortress on Zaitchi Island, Eyre Island. The window into Europe was opened. May the 16th, the fortress foundation ceremony was held. That was the birthday of St. Petersburg. Under the thunder of salute, Peter's associates congratulated the Tsar for the foundation of the new fortress, which was named after St. Peter and St. Paul. And in November 1703, the first foreign merchant ship cast its anchor in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg reminds some visitors of Rome, others of Paris, Venice, Vienna, or Amsterdam. But really, it resembles none. You can spend weeks wandering around the centre of the city and still find something new at every corner. Some words about the White Nights. Nobody can resist the enchantment of St. Petersburg White Nights, when the slender silhouettes of the Peter and Paul fortress, the rostral columns, and the bridges hoisted to open high above the river stand out against the scintillating sky. There are more than 100 museums and permanent exhibitions in St. Petersburg. This phrase can be heard in all excursions in our city. and every excursion begins with the story about the Peter and Paul fortress, the cradle of St. Petersburg. The history of St. Petersburg began on a small island off the northern bank of the Neva, where, on May the 16th, 1703, May the 27th, New Style, the artillery salute signalled the laying of the foundation of the fortress, named St. Petersburg, the town of St. Peter. We should know the city takes its name from the patron, St. Peter, and not from the Tsar, Peter the Great. The new citadel was to protect the lands on the Neva, recaptured from Sweden in the course of the Great Northern War from 1700 to 1721. Flat Hare Island, Zayachi Ostrov, in close vicinity of the sea, attracted the notice of Peter I because of its strategic position and its small size. Construction works were carried out according to the Tsar's own plans. It took less than half a year to build an earthen emplacement. 2.5 years later, work was begun on the construction of a stone building. Peter closed the entrance into the Neva for the Swedes. The plan of fortifications. The plan of fortifications forms an elongated hexagon with 6 bastions connected by straight walls, which are 9 to 12 meters high and 16 to 20 meters wide, and consist of 2 parallel walls filled in with earth and crushed stone. Deep inside the walls are hollow to house the casemates of the local garrison. The fortress lost its military significance before it was completed. Its guns never saw any action and were put to use as a flood warning signal. The fortress housed a political prison for 200 years. It's interesting to know that the relics of Apostle Andrew I called, patron saint of Russia, were immured in the foundation of the fortress. The legend says Peter I marked the place for the fortress gates with 2 birch trees. An eagle sat down on these gates. This was interpreted by everybody as a good sign, and the eagle was taken and put on the arm of the Tsar. Our city has a lot of traditions. This is one of them. The cannon in the Peter and Paul fortress is fired at midday every day. The Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul, with its gilt spire, dominates the whole panorama of the Nieva banks. A weather vane in the form of an angel with a cross is on the top of the building. The angel's wings spread about 4 meters. Till now, it remains the city's tallest architectural structure, which is 122.5 meters high. The cathedral was erected between 1712 and 1733 by the architect Domenico Thrazzini. The architectural style of this cathedral is a combination of different traditions and European styles. The cathedral is the sacred burial place of every Tsar since Peter, with the exception of Nicholas II. The boathouse. You can see the boathouse, a pavilion where Peter's boat was kept. People call the boat the grandfather of the Russian fleet. Nowadays, the boat is kept in the Central Naval Museum. April the 30th, 1993. The Council of Ministers, the government of the Russian Federation, decided to make the historical cultural reservation, the Peter and Paul Fortress, the State Museum of the History of St. Petersburg, on the territory of Zaitchi Island. St. Petersburg, from its very foundation, has several times suffered from flood destruction. The water in the Neva has risen above the 1.5 meter mark over 300 times. Floods are particularly severe in autumn. There are special water level marks made on memorial plaques in the following places. Under the archway of the Nevsky Gate of the Peter and Paul Cathedral, under the archway of the Admiralty Building, on the wall of the Palace of Peter I in the Summer Garden, on the walls of some houses on the Pereulok Rivtsova. St. Petersburg is sometimes called the Northern Venice. A century and that city young, gem of the northern world amazing, from gloomy wood and swamp uprising, had risen in pride and splendor blazing. An extract from The Bronze Horseman by Alexander Pushkin. Today the city stands on 42 islands. The main waterway of the city is the Neva River, and it adds much to the beauty of the city. It is impossible to imagine St. Petersburg without its bridges, canals, and embankments. The city was founded in the mouth where the Neva spills its waters into the Gulf of Finland. It was the first Russian port on the shores of the Baltic Sea. Do you know that the first canal was dug within St. Petersburg fortress? The oldest canal in St. Petersburg is the Kronberg. It was dug in 1706. The longest canal is the Ligovsky, which is 22 kilometers long. It was dug between 1718 and 1721. Later, it was covered up with earth. The shortest canal was the Schiepersky Canal on Basel Island. Its length was 438.5 meters long. The Winter Canal is one of the most charming spots of old St. Petersburg, linking the Neva and the Moika. It is for almost 300 years that St. Petersburg has stood on the banks of the Neva River. It was founded along the ancient trade waterway for centuries connecting peoples of the East and the West. It's well known that 1,500 years ago, the banks of the Gulf of Finland, the Neva and the Volkhov were inhabited by different tribes: Vod, Jura, Kuriela. Later on, in the middle of the 18th century, Slav tribes came to these lands. Their peaceful settlement among the native tribes opened a new page in the history of the Neva area. The legend says that in the 1st century AD, the apostle, Andrew the First Called, went along this waterway from the Black Sea coast to the north of Europe. Some facts about the Neva River. Geologically, the Neva River is very young. The Neva River is only 4,000 years old. It is 74 kilometers, 50 miles, long. It is between 300 and 650 meters wide. It is between 6 and 24 meters deep. All the 8 bridges on the Neva can be drawn apart. It is a very dangerous river. Its level rises when a strong wind blows from the sea. Its current slows down and its level rises. There have been more than 300 floods in St. Petersburg. The first flood was marked in 1703. The last disastrous flood was in 1924. Do you know that there are 539 bridges in St. Petersburg, 342 in the city itself? There are 22 drawbridges. The widest of St. Petersburg's bridges is the Sini Bridge across the Moika, a part of St. Isaac's Square. It is 97.3 meters wide and 32.5 meters long. It was so called as its old timber structure had been painted in that colour. The longest bridge in St. Petersburg is the Alexander Nevsky Bridge. Its length is 909.5 meters long. There are 8 bridges over the Neva. From the Troitsky Bridge, one can see 7 other bridges. The embankments of the Neva, there are 300 of them, have the total length of 150 kilometers. St. Petersburg's bridges, canals and embankments are an integral part of its architectural ensemble and its great history. The lacework of St. Petersburg's railings, the granite embankments and the bridges over the rivers make our city one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The magnificence of Petersburg's palaces is well known, and the city is famous for its architectural ensembles. The first palaces belonged to the nobility, and now they are the most important architectural monuments in Petersburg. The Stroganov Palace is the green building where Nevsky Prospect meets the river Moika. It was built in the middle of the 18th century by Rastrelli. The Anchkov Palace. In 1750, on the bank of the Fontanka River, a palace for Count Alexei Razumovsky was built by the architect Zemtsov. Since 1937, the palace has housed the Palace of Children. The Menshikov Palace was designed by the architect Fontana. It was built between 1710 and 1714. The Summer Palace of Peter I. Peter's Summer Palace, built between 1710 and 1714 by Domenico Trezzini, is located in the garden. The facade of the palace is decorated with a narrow ornamental frieze and bas-reliefs on the mythological subjects glorifying Russia's victory in the Northern War. Such famous architects as Zemtsov, Schluter and Machety took part in the decoration of the palace. Now the Summer Palace houses the Museum of History and Mode of Life devoted to Peter's time. This two-storey, modest stone building was Peter the Great's residence. The layout of the two floors is identical: 6 living rooms, a kitchen, and a room for servants. The top floor was occupied by Catherine I, and the ground floor by Peter. The palace is one of the oldest structures in St. Petersburg. The Winter Palace was built in the Baroque style and designed by the famous Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli between 1754 and 1762. It was a residence of Russian Tsars and also has served as a repository of great art since the time of Catherine II. Today, the rooms of the Winter Palace house the collections of the State Hermitage. The State Hermitage is the largest museum in our country and the second largest museum in the world. Only the Louvre is larger. The Hermitage comprises 5 buildings. The Winter Palace, which was designed by Rastrelli between 1754 and 1762. The Small Hermitage, designed by de la Mothe in 1775. The Old Hermitage, designed by Felton between 1775 and 1787. The Hermitage Theatre, designed by Quarenghi. And the New Hermitage, designed by Klentz between 1839 and 1859, and also Stasov, Yefimov, and the sculptor Turebiev. All the buildings are interconnected by passages in the form of arches, covered bridges, and a hanging garden. The oldest and the largest is the Winter Palace, which was built and designed in the Russian Baroque style by the eminent architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli between 1754 and 1762. It's executed in fine taste and is Rastrelli's masterpiece. The palace building is nearly 2 kilometers long in perimeter, 22 meters high. For a long time, the palace was the biggest and most elegant building in St. Petersburg. In 1837, the fire, which blazed for 3 days, destroyed everything but the brick walls. The restoration was done by the architects Starov and Bryulov. They completely preserved Rastrelli's exterior, while the interior was decorated according to the changed fashion. All these treasures were closed to the general public, and only Tsars and their courts had access. Catherine wrote of her possessions in the Hermitage that all this is only for the mice and myself to admire. Even many years later, only specially selected guests and members of the royal family and courtiers were allowed to enter. In 1852, the Hermitage was opened to the public as a museum, but common people were not admitted. After the Revolution, the Hermitage was opened to all people. There are many parks in St. Petersburg, and we shall describe just a few of them. The ensembles, which were designed by Rossi, are the most remarkable architectural and historical memorials of St. Petersburg. Ostrovsky Square was designed by Rossi. In the centre of Ostrovsky Square, there is a monument of Catherine II. The Summer Garden, the oldest in the city, was laid out in 1704. Peter the Great dreamed of creating a garden more beautiful than that at Versailles, and planted its first trees. The garden was created in regular style, with straight alleys and paths, clipped shrubs and trees. It originally had dozens of fountains and sculptures brought from abroad. There was a hothouse for exotic plants and rare birds. Swans swam in a canal specially dug for them. At first, water for the fountains was pumped by a great wheel, turned by horses, from the river nearby the garden, which has been called the Fontanka. Later, a water tower was built. Finally, water was brought from the Dudahof Lake, not far from the city, the level of which was about 75 meters higher than that of the Neva. The water first ran through a 20-kilometer canal to the city pool, and then 1.5 kilometers through the pipe system. The pipes were laid on the bottom of the Fontanka. It was a remarkable hydraulic project for its time. Disastrous floods of 1777 caused great damage to the summer garden. The fountains and some pavilions were not reconstructed. Peter the Great used the gardens as the location for festivities called assemblies. He ordered assemblies and masquerades to be held, and all courtiers and nobility gathered here with their wives and adult children. Sometimes they were required to arrive in rowing boats or sailing boats. Nobody could refuse from attending these assemblies. For a long time, the garden was open only to aristocrats. The following decree was issued by Nicholas I. The summer garden is open to all military men and decently dressed people. Ordinary people, mujiks, will not be allowed to walk through the garden. What can we see in the summer garden now? There is a monument of the fabulist Ivan Krylov. The writer is portrayed sitting with a book in his hands. The monument includes animals, birds, and other characters of Krylov's fables. The eminent sculptor Peter Klott made this monument in 1855. A famous grill fences off the summer garden from the Neva embankment. It is one of the finest examples of artistic wrought ironwork in the world. The grill was designed by the architect Yuri Felton. It was told that a 19th century English lord, a patron of the arts, anchored his boat in the Neva by the summer garden. He admired the black and golden grill and then set sail for England without going ashore. When asked the reason for this action, the lord replied that the goal of his voyage had been achieved, and nothing could surpass the splendor of this sight. The summer garden, with its ancient oaks and limes, is a popular place of recreation. Its alleys are decorated with marble sculptures. Among them are the busts of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and the allegorical statues of glory, architecture, navigation, justice, truth, peace, and plenty. Many sculptures were made by the outstanding 18th century Venetian masters. Alexander Pushkin glorified St. Petersburg in his works. He liked to walk along the alleys of the summer gardens. Pushkin once wrote that the summer garden was the last immortal gift from Peter the Great to the city. The Admiralty is the architectural and compositional centre of St. Petersburg. Three main streets of the city converge here: Nevsky Prospekt, Voznesensky Prospekt, and Gorokhovaya Street. Nevsky Prospekt is St. Petersburg's main street. The Admiralty functioned originally as a shipyard, and the building housed workshops and warehouses, as well as different departments. The Admiralty was rebuilt several times, and the present version of the Admiralty was built between 1806 and 1823, and was designed by the Russian architect Zakharov. A 73-meter high spire dominates this structure. The peak of the spire is considered to be a model of Peter the Great's private ship, Ingermanlander, and has become the city's symbol. The main Admiralty building was under construction for more than 100 years. On both sides of the main arch, there are sculptural groups representing nymphs carrying the globe. The main facade of the building is about 407 meters long and consists of two buildings. The central part of the main building is topped with a tower, with a weather vane in the form of a ship on its top. The Admiralty links the three central squares of St. Petersburg: Palace Square, the Square of the Decembrists, and St. Isaac's Square. At the corners of the tower attic stand the statues of Alexander the Great, Achilles, Ajax, and Pyrrhus, designed by the sculptor Shedrin. The statues above the upper colonnade of the tower symbolize the four seasons of the year, four elements of nature, four main winds. There are Isis, the patroness of shipbuilding, and Urania, the muse of astronomy, among them. Such famous sculptors as Paimenov, Demuth Malinovsky, and Anisimov took part in these works. The creator of the main high relief, the establishment of a fleet in Russia, is the sculptor Jerebinev. The relief represents Neptune, who is handing Peter I the trident, a symbol of power over the sea. The lateral parts of the relief are filled with the figures of tritons and nymphs engaged in the shipbuilding works or saluting the ships already launched. Since 1844, only some departments connected with the Navy remained in this building. Now, since 1925, the Admiralty houses the Higher Naval Engineering School.